Hi, folks. Welcome along to episode 28 of Percussion Discussion. Don't forget, you can find us on Instagram, you can find us on Facebook, and you can find us on YouTube. So if you could give us a follow, a like, or a subscribe, you won't miss any of the upcoming interviews or any that we've done in the past. So if you could do that, we're really grateful. Now, joining me today is a real heavyweight of the music world, of the drumming world, a gentleman who has inspired many drummers, especially in the progressive rock side of things. A gentleman who has been playing for one of the biggest bands in the world. It's as simple as that. Pink Floyd, since 1967, when they recorded their debut album. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Nick Mason.
Happy to do it.
Well, it's much appreciated. It really is. So I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. Who were your early influences, around the time when you were starting with Pink Floyd?
Oh, well, I mean, there were a lot of them, but the number one was Ginger Baker.
Right, okay.
Without doubt. But I mean, if you look at the roster of players at that point, all of whom had some input on it, then you'd go Keith Moon, Mitch Mitchell, particularly Mitch, actually, because we ended up doing a tour in sort of the end of '67 with Jimmy and a whole bunch of other people. One of the last proper rock tours, actually. Mm-hmm. So who else? There was Blinky Davidson, who was the drummer with the Nice.
Yeah.
I mean, sort of almost everyone in every band that was around at the time was influential.
Yes, of course. Totally understand that. And obviously, once Pink Floyd had started, when you went to record Piper, for example, back in, I think, was it 67, 68, 67?
Yeah, 67.
Did you have any idea what was going to happen, how it was going to explode? Because it did explode, didn't it? Literally.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is at one level, no, because no one had any indication that rock music was going to be anything other than entirely ephemeral. You have to remember that until the same time Piper was being produced, the Beatles were in number 2 at Abbey Road. We were in 3. And Sgt. Pepper was the album that transformed the industry, really. Suddenly, the whole thing became... it still wouldn't be clear at that time, but the theory was that rock music was something that you did for a year or 2 years, and then you went back to the railways or whatever it was. Even Ringo was thinking about what he'd do after the Beatles within the second year of them working. So, no, of course, no one could have had any inclination, any indication that this was going to be anything of the scale and long lasting.
Yeah, it's done a little better than 2 years. Let's be honest.
Yes. So, well, I'm quite keen on telling people I'm on my 51st gap year.
I like that. And you still have fond and clear memories of recording that album. Obviously, it's a little while ago. Is it still ingrained in the mind?
Oh yeah. I mean, you remember the sort of general. I mean, you remember the general atmosphere and some particular bits of it. I don't have a complete photographic memory of every take of every song. But I certainly remember working with Norman Smith, who had been sort of given to us as a producer, who'd been the engineer on a previous Beatles album. You could see the sort of thinking that was going on at EMI, that they were looking for more Beatles type sort of album bands, really, because every album band made them 10 times more money than a singles band.
Of course. It must have been an exciting time because you were all a young bunch of guys and jumping into the unknown. Really, it must have been very exciting for all of you.
Yeah, of course. But in terms of understanding what we were doing and where we were going, we had, I think, relatively little idea. Most of our aspirations were really to have a hit single and appear on Top of the Pops initially.
So it's good to know it's the same as everybody else. You had the same ideas, even though the music was, well, drastically different, wasn't it? It wasn't.
Well, I don't think it was that. Yes, it was different, but it wasn't a million miles away from what other people were doing and trying to do.
Of course.
And, we were still, for all the sort of rather free-form interstellar overdrives, we were trying very hard to produce, a top 20 single.
Well, it worked. Now, what I've decided to do for this one, you've influenced a lot of people over the years, drummers, musicians, all sorts of from the music world. So I thought I'd ask a few of my friends who I've interviewed before if they have any questions for you, Nick. So first of all, a good friend of mine is Steve Barney. I know your paths have crossed on a couple of occasions. I mentioned that I was chatting to you. So Steve came up with a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. And these are Steve's words. It said, "You've always created such beautifully musical and dynamic drum parts that complement the song. When recording with Pink Floyd, was it always your intention to let the drum parts breathe and create space for the song, or were you naturally responding to the music?" That's a good question.
Yeah, and quite hard to answer, I think. And funnily, it's an interesting one because quite often I listen to particularly some of the early things and think, I wish I'd played less.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I still love the idea of finding the minimum required to make the thing work. I mean, I'm tempted to say it's partly because I always had a fairly low opinion of my actual technique. And so one of the ways to stay out of trouble is to keep things simple. But I also think, I think particularly in the studios, you tend to sort of, you quite often end up minimizing what you're doing rather than adding more and more, particularly with things like Floyd music. Well, not so much only our music, but once we got into multi-tracking, we sort of saw the change from, more or less 2-track. I suppose the early things were done on 4-track.
Yes.
But you really, as you put more and more tracks down with other instruments on or double tracking or whatever, you really find that it's very easy to become overloaded with sound.
Of course.
And so the tendency is to try and do the very simplest level of particularly backing track. I mean, initially we were working on the basis that drums and bass had to go down together.
Yes.
Just because of the shortage of tracks. So, and once you've done that, that really is locked in. You can add things, but you certainly can't ever take them away.
Yes, of course.
I think that probably pushes you towards a rather more minimalist approach.
And do you ever think when back in the early days when you were recording with layering sounds, is it ever in the back of your mind, we're going to have to recreate this live as well, which is going to mean a bigger band, a bigger production?
No, I don't think so, because I think it's not difficult to recreate. I don't think we were ever bothered with worrying about having to recreate things exactly as they were on the record. Yeah, and it isn't difficult generally to recreate the feel of the piece. It's a bit like we played Atom Heart Mother with an orchestra, and we played it without, and it's perfectly workable in both ways. And that's probably the ultimate thing, because orchestras are a bit harder to put into a road box. And but I think that's it. That you just find ways of making it work.
Absolutely. I've often wondered whether that was ever at the forefront. Well, if we do this on a tour, it's going to have to be more musicians, bigger stage. But that's interesting.
No, and I think at the time, I mean, now all the attention goes on the live show. Yeah. But of course, in end of the 60s, early 70s, everything was about the record. The record to get the record right was far more important than getting the show right, because the show was simply a way of promoting the record.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it's switched completely. Then the ticket cost 7 and 6pence, and the album cost £1.
Yeah.
Whereas now the ticket costs 67 quid, and the music's given away.
It puts it into perspective, doesn't it? It really does.
Yeah. Well, it's part of the ongoing, major problem of monetizing the music industry.
Yeah, well,
it affects young bands far more, I think, than us, maybe.
Of course.
In this day and age, but it's very difficult to find ways of making a living.
Absolutely. I'm going to get on to Steve's second question, which is a nice one. It's a really nice question, in fact. Again, Steve's words. And it says, we were both fortunate to know and work with sadly departed drum technician Clive Brooks. Do you have any special memories of touring with Clive that spring to mind?
Well, it's absolutely right. I think Clive's still sorely missed. He was a terrific drum tech, and just very calm, very phlegmatic, which is a good thing. You don't really need overexcited drum techs. And I suppose probably things like Clive stepping in for Willie Wilson when Willie was suddenly taken ill in the middle of some of the wall shows.
Wow.
That's probably the sort of ultimate Clive moment, really.
Just sat in, and that's simple as that.
Yeah, because he'd had the show. Of course, he'd been to every show and play the part.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
And can you remember at the time, he must have been thrilled to do that as well?
Yeah, but I think, of course, it's probably the alarm is what you remember rather than the thrill.
Oh, dear me. But, I mean, obviously, Clive is obviously, I've never needed, and I probably never will need a drum tech, but I know very well regarded, around the world as a great guy and a great drum tech. So I know Steve wanted to get that question in. So there we are. Thank you. Now then, I've also got a question from Steve White. It says, one of the best moments I can ever remember, this is Steve and his wife Sally, was watching you at Live 8. And so he also says you have the best ride cymbal sound in rock, which is a nice compliment. But I asked for a question, and we're heading into your other passion now, the passion for four wheels rather than drums. And it says, what is Nick's perfect car?
Well, it always has to be the same car, which is the Ferrari GTO, because first of all, it's the most wonderful sort of all-rounder as far as cars go. It's a racing car, it's a road car. I took both my daughters to their weddings in the car. It does everything, and it makes me look incredibly clever for having bought it 40-something years ago.
Yeah,
and then watch the value accelerate.
Absolutely. It's better than money in any bank account, that, isn't it? And the second question, this is quite possibly going to be the same answer. What is Nick's... sorry, we've had that one already. He says, well, what is the greatest car ever made, in your opinion? So it might well be the same answer.
Yeah, I mean, one can... if one's really going to sort of argue it, the greatest car is probably the Model T Ford, because it absolutely transformed the way we drive and the way motor cars are used.
Absolutely.
I'm quite interested in the whole sort of the history of the automobile and how and where we're going next, actually, as much as just choosing sort of favorite cars and most valuable cars and so on.
Of course. Yeah, who knows? Well, look, I'm going to get back to drums just briefly. Now, obviously, Steve's already mentioned Live 8, and I remember watching that with such excitement. Obviously, being together again with Roger for the first time in, I don't know, a long, long time. How was that show for you? Did you enjoy that show? Because I thought your playing was spectacular on that night, as dynamic as ever. How was it for you?
Oh, I absolutely loved it. I mean, I loved the whole thing. It was, it was really exciting because as far as I was concerned, initially, there was no way we were going to do it. Bob had asked David, and David had been absolutely adamant he wouldn't do it. And then I got a call from Bob saying, would I talk to David? And I said, it won't make any difference, it won't hurt. So the only person who could persuade David to do it is Roger.
Yeah.
And so I rang Roger and suggested that he ought to ring David and do it, which he did. And then the whole thing began to happen. I really enjoyed the whole process. The rehearsals were great. And just doing the thing was probably, in terms of just from the point of view of even my children, that thing about a lot of grumpy old men can get together and do something for the right reasons occasionally.
I mean, were you aware of the excitement and that it created? Obviously, you all being back together again on stage. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, I think so, because I think there was a great mix of bands on the show.
Yeah,
but I think it was that feeling of going up there as the sort of rather more senior members of the industry, and seeing a lot of the younger bands actually coming to sort of see what we do and what we did.
It was incredible. I remember watching it. I mean, obviously, Steve, who asked the question before, had been playing drums with The Who on that particular night as a one-off. And he said, we were in the artist's enclosure. And as he said, it was one of the best things they've ever seen, which is quite a compliment, And I was watching it at home. But I thought particularly your playing was fabulous that night, as dynamic as ever. And yes, it was a great night.
Oh, thank you.
That's my pleasure. Now then, I'd like to ask about one song in particular, and that is Time. The beautiful rototom parts that you have in there. Do you play that the same every time? Is it exactly, because it's a hell of a lot to remember that, isn't it? And it's not straightforward.
No, and the answer is no. I don't believe there is a single recording that is duplicated completely in every detail. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's exactly how it should be. That
yes.
Every time it's an opportunity to rethink it and play. I mean, the dynamics of it should be that it builds rather than anything else. But the way it builds is entirely up to me, or indeed anyone else who plays that part. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously a nightmare if you're a tribute band, because every time you hear it, you've got to modify what you do. But no, I'm a great believer in this idea that with virtually any song, unless there's some very specific, some of the songs have specific breaks or fills that really should be kept in.
Yeah.
But in general, it's you put the idea across rather than every single note as it was on the record.
Yeah. I'm so glad you answered that, because I keep seeing people asking for transcriptions of it, and then they'll say, well, which version? Because obviously you could be transcribing for the next 3 years.
The multi-part work, yeah.
But obviously we were talking about time and space and what have you. Now, you've quite often worked with another drummer or percussionist, and one of my favourite sort of eras for Pink Floyd was when you had Gary Wallace alongside you. I thought that was a great partnership. The space was still there, but Gary played some really inventive stuff. Was that an enjoyable period for you working with Gary?
Oh yeah, I mean, in a way, working with two drummers is like a one-on-one sort of drum lesson every night, and it's terrific because you're just exchanging ideas. Again, you maybe have to be a little bit more geared to the idea of playing the part. Certainly with a show like The Wall, which was two drummers, but it was with Willie most of the time. It is more specific. It's not scored, but you tend to have to stick to to what's written or rehearsed. But I think with Gary, there was a certain amount of freedom for us to do whatever we wanted, and as I say, you can exchange ideas, on stage.
Of course, it worked, and visually, it was fabulous as well.
Gary is a sight to be seen. He always makes me look as though I'm fast asleep.
I think complemented each other really well, and it's. But I had to ask about that because that was my favorite period. Really, I think it all worked beautifully well. And
I think it worked. I think it's probably true for most of us that actually, if you are playing with another drummer, it's a lovely, it's a great place to be because you sort of know that that you're both going to look after each other in terms of things going wrong. No, I really enjoy it.
It was a great time.
The thing that I always think about with two drummers, though, is that 2 or 3 years ago, I was asked to do a charity event by Ron Dennis. And what he'd done was he'd got Roger Taylor to do something. He wanted a drum battle, but I talked to Roger about it, and we thought we'd try and work something out. Anyway, sadly, we got so involved in lunch, we never really did work very much out. But we worked out that the important thing was to end together. That would give it a sense of what was happening, and we could sort of try and work together through that. What we didn't know is that we would be placed at opposite ends of the room, and it was a large room. And so with our slightly degraded eyesight, we couldn't actually signal very much to each other. So we happily bashed away for about 10 minutes. And then we did have a trick for ending the thing together. And everyone afterwards was enormously complimentary. They absolutely bore it out that what matters is the finale.
Absolutely. Oh dear me, that sounds amazing. And look, let's skip to where we are now. Obviously, it's been a very strange and challenging year. Have you been up to anything playing wise or music, Nick, or have you just been kind of relaxing and
Well, I suppose the very, very little playing. Basically, what we spent most of this last year doing was moving the tour that was planned sort of further forward, and I'm still not quite sure when we will get out and where. We certainly have dates in mind, but as we're reliant really on what our government, but also all the other governments come up with in terms of protocols.
Of course.
I mean, what was nice was we've finally got our live album released, which was, and there was some promotion for that and so on. So it's not been completely, not completely lost, but it does feel a bit as though we've not really done very much.
Yeah. And do you, obviously at a time like this, do you miss playing drums? Does drums is still a passion for you?
Oh yeah, but I mean, I think most of all I miss, the whole sort of sources thing, because
yes.
we'd actually done a year and a half, nearly 2 years of it, but it was really sort of getting better and better, which is, I suppose, really what you always want.
Of course.
With music. You don't want to sort of settle in and say, well, we've got it now. It sort of stays the same. By the time we actually got to the Roundhouse in September 2019, it just felt that was the best show we'd done so far. And that was the next stepping stone, really.
So do you feel it's undone? Well, hopefully it won't have undone any of that for you, but...
No, I think we can pick up where we left off. I think we probably need to rehearse for longer than we originally thought. But I'd suspect that... No, I think even from Pink Floyd experience, you sort of more or less pick up where you left off.
Of course. Well, that's been fantastic. Look, Nick, I'm not going to take up any more of your valuable time. I really appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to do this. And before we go, I have to thank our lovely mutual friend, Mr. Simon Kirk, for making this happen. So thank you, Simon.
That was very good. Very happy memories of Simon and I doing the Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp together, which is an extraordinary American operation where they get a bunch of musicians in and then a bunch of enthusiasts who come and do a pretty hardcore long weekend of playing and arranging and finally performing.
That sounds incredible. So are you essentially the tutors for the weekend or the week or what have you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's a limit to how much tutoring you're going to do, but you certainly can sort of help knock it into shape.
Yeah. That sounds like great fun. And plenty of autographs signed at the end as well, I'm sure.
That's some of that.
Look, Nick, thank you ever so much for taking the time to do this. Really, really appreciate it. So let's hope we see you back on the road very, very soon.
Well, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye now. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.